It was supposed to be the most perfect morning of their lives. Faith and Daniel had waited years for this moment. The wedding was set for 3 o'clock at the Riverside Grand, one of the most elegant venues in the city. Faith stood in front of the mirror wearing her mother's wedding dress, altered perfectly to fit her frame. Daniel was downstairs in the hotel lobby with his best man, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. But something was wrong. In that moment, neither of them knew that everything they believed about their families was about to shatter. Neither of them understood that the next few hours would change them forever. When you think about the people you love most, you assume you know them. You assume the stories they've told you are the complete truth. You believe the image they presented to the world is authentic. But what happens when you discover that the person you trusted most has been living a hidden life? What happens when a secret, kept for decades, suddenly explodes into the open? Before we go any further into what happened that morning, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Maybe United States, or United Kingdom, or Canada, or anywhere you're watching from, and what time is it there now? We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is a story about love, betrayal, acceptance, and the complicated truth that families are rarely what they seem. This is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Faith had grown up in a quiet suburb just outside of Portland, Oregon. Her father was Robert, a high school principal respected throughout the community for his dedication to education and his seemingly perfect family life. Faith's mother, Christine, was a nurse who spent her evenings volunteering at the local hospital. They had been married for 38 years. By all outward appearances, Robert and Christine had the kind of marriage that made other people envious. They held hands at church. They traveled together every summer. They attended their children's events with pride. Faith had 2 brothers and a sister, and all of them believed their parents were the gold standard of a committed relationship. Faith had even referenced her parents' marriage in her wedding vows, telling Daniel that she hoped their love could be as strong and enduring as theirs. Daniel S., on the other hand, came from a different kind of household. His father, George, had been a businessman who worked long hours at his investment firm. Daniel's mother passed away when he was 14, and George had never remarried. George was a quiet man, reserved in his emotions, but deeply loving toward his son. He attended every one of Daniel's football games in high school. He helped him through college. George seemed like the kind of father every young man wished he had. Daniel and Faith met in their junior year of college at a university 2 hours away from their homes. They both majored in business, and they connected immediately over shared values and quiet ambition. Their courtship was the kind that made sense to everyone around them. They dated for 5 years before Daniel proposed on a snowy December evening. The engagement was celebrated by both families. Planning the wedding became a shared family project. Faith's mother helped choose the dress. Daniel's father helped negotiate the venue. Both families looked forward to this union, not just as a marriage, but as a symbol of the bond between 2 respectable, trustworthy families. But on the morning of the wedding, as guests arrived at the Riverside Grand and took their seats, something felt slightly off to Faith. She was getting her hair done in the bridal suite on the 3rd floor when she noticed something unusual. Her father and George had been talking quietly in the hallway outside her room. That was normal. What wasn't normal was the way they were speaking to each other. She heard fragments through the door, anxious voices, hushed whispers. Her mother knocked softly and entered, smiling. But Faith noticed her mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Christine seemed distracted. When Faith asked if everything was okay, Christine assured her it was just the normal chaos of a wedding day. But Faith wasn't convinced. There was something her mother wasn't telling her. Minutes later, as the photographer set up shots, Faith's best friend Rachel pulled her aside and asked if everything was all right between Robert and George. Rachel said she'd noticed them having what seemed like a tense conversation by the elevators. Faith laughed it off, telling Rachel that she was imagining things, that families always had little moments of tension. But internally, Faith felt a knot forming in her stomach. What was Robert and George talking about with such intensity? Why had her mother looked so troubled? What secret had been hidden in the comfortable, predictable lives of these 2 men that Faith thought she understood completely? As Faith put on her veil and prepared to walk down the aisle, she pushed these concerns aside. She told herself it was just wedding day jitters affecting everyone. She had no idea that in less than an hour she would witness something that would reframe everything she thought she knew about her father. The ceremony was beautiful. Faith walked down the aisle to the sound of the string quartet. Daniel stood waiting for her at the altar with tears in his eyes. The vows were spoken with genuine emotion. The rings were exchanged. It was the moment they'd been dreaming of. But something shifted as they turned to walk back down the aisle as husband and wife. Robert, sitting in the front row, stood to applaud, but his face looked pale. He caught George's eye for a brief moment, and that exchange, that single moment of connection between the two men, carried a weight that Faith couldn't ignore. During the cocktail hour, while Faith and Daniel greeted guests, something happened that would echo through the rest of that day and change their understanding of love, family, and truth. Faith's brother Thomas pulled her aside near the coat check. His face was flushed and he seemed agitated. Thomas told Faith that he needed to show her something, but he couldn't do it in front of everyone. He led her to a quiet hallway on the second floor of the venue, away from the celebration. Thomas explained that he'd been looking for the bathroom earlier, when he'd accidentally walked down a corridor he shouldn't have. He'd seen their father, Robert, and Daniel's father, George, walking together into a private room. But that wasn't the shocking part. Thomas said they were holding hands, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. Thomas told Faith that he'd followed them briefly, and through a cracked door, he'd seen Robert and George embrace. Not a hug of greeting, but an embrace that carried intimacy. Faith's world stopped. She asked Thomas if he was sure about what he'd seen. He said he was absolutely certain. He said that their own father, their seemingly perfect, devoted father, had been sharing an intimate moment with Danielis' father in a hotel room on the day that Faith was marrying Daniel. For several moments, Faith couldn't speak. She felt nausea rising in her throat. Her hands grew cold. She asked Thomas if he had told anyone else. He said no, only her. Faith's mind raced through possibilities. Was this affair? Was this a one-time thing? How long had this been going on? How was this possible? The man she'd based her entire understanding of committed love on was apparently living a secret life. And worse, Daniel's father was part of this secret too. Faith excused herself and found Daniel in the grand ballroom, talking with his uncle. She pulled him aside and whispered that they needed to talk in private. She didn't explain why. She couldn't. Daniel, sensing the urgency in her tone, followed her to their suite upstairs. Once inside, Faith told Daniel everything Thomas had seen. She watched the expression on his face change from confusion to shock to something like betrayal. Daniel asked if she was certain about what Thomas had witnessed. She said she wasn't, not directly, but her brother had no reason to lie. The two of them sat in silence for several minutes. This was supposed to be their wedding night. These were supposed to be the first hours of their married life together. Instead, they were grappling with information that felt impossible and yet somehow true. Daniel said they needed to talk to their fathers. Faith disagreed at first. She said they should wait, that emotions were too raw, that confrontation might cause irreparable damage. But Daniel felt differently. He said that if this was happening, if their fathers were involved in something secret, then they deserved to know the truth. He said secrets like this would only grow and fester. Faith, though terrified, agreed. Together they went to find Robert and George. They found both men in the hotel bar on the lower level, sitting together, speaking quietly. When Robert saw Faith and Daniel approaching, his face changed immediately. He stood up. He seemed to know what was coming. The bar was empty of other guests at that moment, which felt almost providential. Faith, her voice shaking, asked her father directly if he was having an affair with Daniel's father. The question hung in the air like a stone that had been thrown into still water. Robert didn't deny it. George also stood, and the two men exchanged a look that was difficult to interpret. Robert sat back down slowly and asked Faith and Daniel to sit with them. His voice was quiet but steady as he began to speak. He said that what they had just witnessed wasn't what they thought it was. Or rather, it was exactly what they thought it was, but it was complicated in ways they couldn't understand from a single moment. George added that this wasn't something that had just begun. This wasn't a new indiscretion or a moment of weakness. This was something that had been a central, profound part of both of their lives for decades. Faith felt her chest tighten. Decades. Robert had been married to Christine for nearly 40 years. He had 3 other children besides Faith. He had built a life, a family, a reputation. And in the middle of all of that, he had been maintaining a secret relationship with George. The reality was too large to process. Daniel asked how long this had been going on. George answered carefully. He said it had started 32 years ago, long before either of them were married. He said that when they were younger, before their families, before their responsibilities, they had loved each other. And then life had happened. Social pressure had happened. Family expectations had happened. George had married Daniel's mother, who he cared for deeply. Robert had married Christine, who he also cared for deeply. But they had never stopped loving each other. They had found ways to see each other over the years, carefully, quietly. They had built a parallel life that existed in the margins of their public lives. Faith wanted to scream. Daniel wanted to understand. Neither of them could do either effectively. If you're still watching, drop a comment with, "I'm still here," so we know who's writing this case out with us. Over the next several hours, Robert and George explained their relationship in a way that was both heartbreaking and, in some strange way, profound. They spoke about meeting in college, about a connection that had felt like coming home. They spoke about the pressure society had placed on them to live conventional lives, to hide who they truly were. They spoke about the pain of suppressing their authentic selves for decades, but they also spoke about the love they felt for their families. Robert spoke about the deep affection he held for Christine, about the genuine partnership they had built together. He spoke about the 3 other children he had raised, about how much he loved them. He said that his love for George and his love for his family were not in contradiction. Love, he explained, was not a finite resource. You could hold multiple truths at once. Faith sat listening to her father speak, and she felt a complicated mixture of emotions. There was anger. She was angry that he had deceived everyone for so long. There was pain. She was hurt that he felt he had to hide this part of himself, but there was also, somewhere deep inside, a dawning understanding. Robert had been living with an impossible choice. He could live authentically as himself and risk losing his family and his standing in his community, or he could live a divided life. He had chosen the divided life. Was that choice wrong? Faith didn't know anymore. Daniel, listening to his father speak with a vulnerability he'd never heard before, felt similarly confused. George explained that he had loved Daniel's mother in his own way. He had been present for Daniel. He had supported him and raised him with genuine care. But there was a part of him that had always been incomplete, a part of him that had belonged to Robert. George said that if he had been born in a different time, in a different place, things might have been different, but he hadn't been. He had done the best he could with the choices available to him. Faith asked Robert directly, "Did Christine know?" There was a long pause. Robert said that Christine had suspected for many years. She had never asked directly, and he had never volunteered the information. But he believed that on some level, she knew. He said that Christine had chosen to stay in their marriage and to accept him for who he was, even without full disclosure. He said that was an act of love as well. Faith's brother Thomas came to find them as the conversation was reaching an end. He had been searching for Faith to make sure she was okay. When he arrived at the bar and saw the 4 of them sitting together, his expression reflected the shock and confusion that Faith was feeling. Robert asked all 3 young people to sit down. He wanted to explain everything to all of them, not just Faith. Over the course of that evening, as the wedding celebration continued upstairs without them, Robert and George told their story more fully. They spoke about the risk they had taken in finally being honest. They spoke about the fear they had experienced, not knowing how their loved ones would react. But they also spoke about how exhausting it had been to carry the secret alone. They spoke about how liberating it felt in that moment to no longer hide. Faith found herself asking questions she didn't know she wanted answers to. She asked her father if he had ever considered leaving Christine. Robert said he had considered it many times, but he said he had also realized that the fantasy of leaving, of starting over, of living openly was just that, a fantasy. In reality, leaving would have destroyed Christine, would have damaged his other children, would have created a scandal that Robert wasn't sure he had the courage to face. He had made a choice to stay, to build a full life with Christine, and to maintain his relationship with George in secret. Was it perfect? No. Was it dishonest? Yes. But it was also, he explained, a way of trying to honor all the people he loved. Faith didn't forgive him instantly. She didn't suddenly think that everything was okay, but she began to understand that forgiveness might be possible. She began to understand that her father was a human being with competing desires and impossible choices, not just the perfect father figure she had imagined him to be. Over the next several days, after Faith and Daniel had time to process what they had learned, they each reached out to their respective parents. Faith called her mother, Christine. The conversation was difficult. Christine acknowledged what Faith had discovered and explained that she had indeed been aware for many years. Christine described the journey she had taken in coming to terms with Robert's sexuality and his relationship with George. She said that she had never stopped loving Robert, even after she realized what he was hiding. She said that she had chosen to stay because she believed in their partnership, in the life they had built together. Christine explained that Robert had been a devoted husband and father in every way that mattered. Yes, he had a secret, but that didn't erase the genuine affection and commitment he had shown to his family. Christine said that sometimes people are more complex than we want to believe. Sometimes the people we love live with contradictions that we struggle to understand, but that doesn't mean they don't deserve to be loved. Daniel called his father George. George expected rejection or anger. Instead, Daniel told his father that he loved him and that he was trying to understand. Daniel asked George what his life might have been like if he had lived in a time when he could be openly in love with Robert. George said he didn't allow himself to think about alternate lives. He said he had done the best he could with the life he had. He said that Daniel was one of the best things in his life, and he wouldn't change that, even if everything else could be different. Daniel told his father that he understood now. He understood that George had loved Daniel's mother. He understood that George loved Robert. He understood that George loved him. And somehow, in a way that defied conventional wisdom, all of those loves could coexist. Faith and Daniel made the decision to tell the rest of their families the truth. Not immediately, but in their own time. Faith's 3 other siblings each had their own journey of processing the information. Some were more understanding than others, but eventually Robert's full family came to a place of acceptance. They understood that their father was not the person they thought he was, but that didn't mean he wasn't still their father. They understood that he had made difficult choices under impossible circumstances. And they understood that sometimes acceptance and forgiveness are acts of courage. The wedding, which had been disrupted by this revelation, ultimately became a symbol of something else. It became the moment when a family decided that love was more important than shame. It became the moment when people chose truth over comfort. And perhaps most importantly, it became the moment when Faith and Daniel learned that the love of their own marriage would be tested, deepened, and made more real through their willingness to love their families, flaws and all. Faith's parents never divorced. Christine and Robert remained married. Robert and George continued their relationship, now with the knowledge of their families. Was it conventional? No. Was it what anyone would have chosen for themselves? Perhaps not, but it was honest. And in the end, that honesty allowed everyone involved to move forward with greater integrity than they had lived before. Now that you've heard this story, we have to ask you, what would you have done in Faith's position? When you discovered that someone you loved deeply had been living a secret life, how would you have reacted? Would you have been able to move from anger to understanding? Would you have been able to forgive? And more importantly, how do you think about the choices that Robert made? Was he wrong to hide who he was? Or was he doing the best he could under the constraints of the time and society he was living in? These are not easy questions. There are no simple answers. But these are the questions that make us human. These are the moments that teach us something profound about love, about family, and about the complexity of the people around us. If you thought this story was surprising, wait until you hear what happened next in our upcoming story. Some relationships was tested in ways they never expected. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so you never miss the continuation of this remarkable story. And comment below. Tell us what you would have done. Would you have chosen acceptance like Faith did? Or would you have made a different choice? We want to hear from you. Thank you for listening to this story of love, secrets, and the complicated beauty of human connection. This is the kind of story that reminds us that families are not perfect, but they are real. And that realness, when we allow ourselves to see it, can be more beautiful than any fantasy we might have constructed instead.